The key I shouldn't have copied. I should begin with the key because that was the moment the old me disappeared. It was a small brass copy, cut at the kiosk around the corner from my office, heavy enough to warm in my pocket. I told myself it was precaution, that people who were cheated on were always the last to know, and I refused to be the man who knocked and waited while his life was being edited on the other side of a door. I told myself a lot of things that week. Most of them were lies. My name is Julian. I am not remarkable unless you find steadiness remarkable. I used to think my greatest strengths were patience and logic. I work in commercial design. I can look at an empty floor and tell you where the light will fall at 4 in the afternoon in December. I believed I could map a human life with the same calm certainty. Then came the gaps, those thin slivers of darkness where explanation doesn't reach and imagination rushes in to do the cruel work. Her name is Mara. For 8 years she was my axis. We didn't sizzle, we glowed. She collected books she swore she would read someday, and I built her the shelves. We learned each other's appetites and edges, and for a long time that felt like the purest kind of intimacy. But you don't notice the first hairline crack in glass until you hear it sing. The crack for me was laughter, hers soft and newly private. It showed up a little before midnight on Tuesdays, then Thursdays. She would step onto the balcony with her phone against her ear and laugh a laugh I hadn't heard in years. Not bigger, closer. She'd come back inside with the cold still on her skin, and when I reached for her, she would smile at me like someone remembering a childhood place, fondly from a distance. I told myself not to be paranoid. I told myself to focus on facts. The facts. A locked phone that hadn't needed a lock before, lipstick in a shade called Molten she swore she bought for an interview that never happened, a shirt I didn't recognize balled deep in the laundry basket, smelling like cedar and something sharper, and a loft on Vestry Street I had never been invited to see. The loft belonged to a photographer named Theo. I knew that because I'd heard the name twice, once from Mara, once from a friend who didn't know I was listening when she said, "Oh, you should see Theo's place, it's like a film set. There's a swing." She laughed. That was when the key in my pocket became inevitable. I waited until I knew she'd be there. I am not proud of this, and I would like to say that I almost turned back, but that's not true. When I reached the building, my own heartbeat felt like an alarm. The elevator, the smell of paint and pine cleaner, the sterile light in the hallway, all of it came razor sharp, as if my body wanted to record every second in case I decided to deny it later. The key worked. Of course it did. Betrayal is rarely stopped by a lock. The loft opened around me, concrete and glass in the kind of careful mess that looks like truth. Light spilled from behind a curtain toward the back. I could have called out. Instead, I moved the way a person moves through a museum, slow and reverent. On the kitchen island sat a bowl of clementines and a note in Mara's handwriting. "Door unlocked for you." I stood there with that note in my hands, a man reading his own eulogy. Their voices came from the curtained area, low, then a laughter like she had on the balcony. I don't know why I didn't walk in. Maybe I believed there was a version of me who wouldn't survive seeing them. Maybe I thought if I only heard it, I could pretend it wasn't as bad as my brain would make it later. I stood, useless and breathing, while fabric whispered and the soft music of two bodies learning each other again played out like a song I hadn't been invited to hear. I left the note where I found it. I closed the door carefully behind me. I took the elevator in silence and walked 15 blocks in the wrong direction because moving felt better than knowing, and knowing felt like a burn I had to let cool before I touched it again. When I got home, Mara was already there. Somehow the city had folded time in on itself so I could fall into the precise theater of our kitchen. Her making chamomile tea she never drank, me rinsing 2 glasses we wouldn't use. She glanced up through her lashes. "You're late," she said. not accusation, habit. I nodded, a man acting in a play that had already ended. We didn't speak of keys or clementines or swings. That night when she reached for me in bed, her touch was cautious and hot, as if she were testing the surface of water she wasn't sure was safe. I let her draw me under. We moved like people drowning. Passion is not proof, but it can impersonate it so well that, for a minute, you forget to ask for ID. In the morning, I went to work, and at lunch I found myself sitting in a bar I'd never been to, looking like a man who had lost a fight nobody saw. That's where I met Sierra. She was there with a stack of script pages, a pen in her hair like an anchor pinning a storm in place. She asked me for the salt. I handed her my heart. That's what it felt like, that startling ease, the way a stranger can see you more clearly than anyone who claims to love you because they aren't invested in your disguise. We didn't plan anything. We simply collided again the next day and the next. I learned that Sierra wrote shows people pretended not to watch and watched at 2 a.m. anyway. She learned that I built spaces for other people to live in and never really considered what I needed in my own. We talked until the bar turned the lights brighter, the universal cue for take this somewhere else. And we did. The first time with Sierra was not tender. It was hungry, the kind of rush that knocks books from shelves and sends a glass spinning harmlessly into a cushion, because chaos has good aim when it wants to. Her mouth was fearless. My hands remembered a language I thought I'd forgotten. We didn't say each other's names at first because names would have made it something we might feel guilty about later. We did not want names. We wanted proof, of life, of want, of the fact that our bodies could still light, even in a room thick with other people's ashes. After, lying side by side on her couch, I stared at the ceiling fan and thought of keys and notes, and the awful kindness of strangers who hold your gaze when you confess you are not the person you meant to be. Sierra propped herself on an elbow and traced a line from my collarbone to my wrist. "Whoever she is," she said, not asking for a name, "she doesn't get to be the entire map." I didn't intend to keep both worlds. That's the thing about duplicity. It starts as survival and turns into momentum. With Mara, I began to perform a version of myself who still believed. With Sierra, I didn't perform at all, and that was its own kind of danger. In the middle, there was a man who knew he could not live like this and did it anyway. The collision, when it came, felt choreographed by a director with a taste for cruelty. I had agreed to meet Sierra at a gallery opening in Tribeca, a photographer I barely registered because my attention was already a live wire. The room pulsed with people who looked like they were practicing being seen. I turned to the door exactly as Mara walked in, her arm tucked into Theo. Both of them methodically gorgeous in a way I could have admired if it hadn't been a blade. We all did the briefest arithmetic out loud with our faces. Then Mara chose walking. She crossed the room with the kind of calm that announces there will be blood as soon as the curtain falls. She kissed my cheek, just left of my mouth, leaving a print light as a bruise. "Hello, darling," she said, eyes on Sierra when she said it. Theo stayed a measured pace behind her, a man who knew how to let a woman stage the scene. Introductions were a civility we pretended to afford each other. Sierra extended her hand to Mara with a composure I would have fallen in love with even if I hadn't already. Thea gave me the kind of handshake men offer men they don't need to beat because they've already won. There was champagne. There was art. There were 3 people I would have taken a bullet for last year, and I the 4th, hollow with a hesitation I couldn't afford. We didn't fight until we got home. That's the thing about public rooms. You roll your shoulders back and pretend you have the muscles for this. In our kitchen, we dropped the act. Mara began, not with accusations but with a smile I recognized from the note on the island. "You copied his key," she said, not a question. "You've always been good with copies." I opened my mouth to say I was sorry, to say I was furious, to say I didn't know which man I was, and none of it stepped forward. She moved closer. The air changed the way it does right before summer rain, heavy, electric, clean. "So," she murmured, "we're even." I didn't know what even meant anymore. I only knew her breath smelled like the pear she had eaten in the cab and a little like him, and that realization ignited something I wasn't proud of and couldn't ignore. We didn't talk, we tore. There are people who think sex after betrayal is a bridge. For me, it was a bonfire. We burned. The counter dug into my spine. Her thigh had a crescent moon of marble dust when I pressed her there. She was ruthless and tender in alternating seconds, the way a wave is, the way grief is. When I came, it felt like grief too, a body admitting what the mind refused to. You can love a person and mourn them at the same time. In the shower after, we said the truest things we'd said in months. She told me she didn't start with Theo to hurt me. I told her I didn't start with Sierra to hurt her. Neither of those sentences made us innocent. We both knew it. But truth is a relief, even when it burns. We stayed. People always ask me why. Why not end it? Why not start clean? The honest answer is that clean is a fantasy. You can leave a person, you cannot leave yourself. And there was love, stubborn and inconvenient, growing out of the ash like the first green after a fire. We went to therapy. We pretended to be people who believed in therapy. We talked about boundaries and remorse and the difference between privacy and secrecy. We stopped using the words always and never. We started using the word try. Trying is not romantic, but it is real. I stopped seeing Sierra every night. I told her the truth the same week I told Mara the rest of mine. Sierra did not throw anything. She didn't cry the way movie women cry. She sat with her hands folded around a mug of coffee and looked at the man I was, and I had the indecent thought that I had wanted to be that man with her. "So this is the part," she said softly, "where you choose what story you're going to live." She kissed my cheek and didn't ask for the key I'd never made. When trust breaks, it doesn't regrow as the same plant. It comes back thornier, or it doesn't come back at all. With Mara, it returned as something wary and strangely sexy. We confessed more, not because honesty is always noble, but because we learned that lies were attacks we could no longer afford. We rebuilt our bed like a country redrawing its borders after a war, contested, negotiated, sometimes unkind. And yet, the nights that followed were some of the most alive of my life. Desire, when sharpened by ruin, has an edge that can cut you free or cut you apart, often both. Once, months later, we walked past the kiosk where I'd had the key cut. Mara stopped, bought a brass blank, and threaded it on a chain. "For the studio," she said. "You can come whenever, or you can knock." I asked what she preferred. She smiled, sliding the chain over my head. "I prefer the man who doesn't need either." We still falter. There are mornings when one of us flinches at a memory and the other pretends not to see. There are days when the past walks in wearing new clothes and asks if it can stay. But we have become the people who answer the door together. It isn't a fortress. It is a house with windows we open and close on purpose. Sometimes, when the city hums into its low blue evening and the balcony is soft with air, Mara steps outside with her phone. She calls me from 6 feet away and tells me something filthy in a voice that used to belong to the dark. We both laugh. Then she slides the phone into her pocket and turns toward me, her face lit with a heat I know, and we walk back inside. If you're asking for advice, I have none that doesn't sound like a fortune cookie wound. I can only tell you what I learned when the key turned, when the curtain failed to protect me, when the note on an island said the door had been left unlocked. I learned that love is not proof against desire, that fidelity is not a single promise but a ritual of 1,000 small choices, that you cannot punish a body into telling the truth, but you can coax a truth into becoming a body again. Most nights now, I fall asleep to the rhythm of her breathing like I used to, only it isn't the same sleep. It's a sleep that knows the world can tilt and still right itself. It's a sleep that knows we are both capable of cruelty and kindness, that the line between them is as thin as a curtain in a loft I once entered without knocking. Some mornings, I wake before she does and watch sun find the curve of her shoulder, and I think about copies and originals. I think about the difference between unlocking a door and being invited in. I keep the brass key on a nail by the front door. It is useless now. We changed the locks, but I leave it there to remind myself. The old me is gone, and the man who replaced him didn't save the relationship by pretending the crack never happened. He learned to trace it with his finger, to understand the song the glass makes when it breaks, and to hear in it, not an ending, but the overture to whatever comes next.